Welcome to the New Books Network.
Hello and welcome to another episode on the New Books Network. I'm one of your hosts, Dr. Miranda Melcher, and I'm very pleased today to be speaking with Dr. Jessica Brockmole about her book titled Pink Cars and Pocketbooks: How American Women Bought Their Way into the Driver's Seat, published by Johns Hopkins University Press in 2025. This book takes us through a really interesting journey about journeys. Maybe that's too many puns. We'll see. But we're looking here about the history of the US car industry, but not just kind of how cars are constructed. Also, how are they advertised? Who are they advertised to? How and why does that change that over time? And also, how do women consumers respond to this? They're not just passive recipients of what the car industry decides. As we're going to find out, they very much have and act on their own agency and opinions. So this is quite a fascinating history, I think, to get into. Jessica, thank you so much for joining me on the podcast.
Thank you so much for having me.
Could you please start us off by introducing yourself a little bit and tell us why you even decided to write this book?
Absolutely. Well, I'm Jessica Brockmole. I'm a writer and an independent historian. And Pink Cars and Pocketbooks, my history of how the American auto industry and its consumers battled to define what women wanted in a car, is my first work of academic nonfiction. I've taken a little bit of an unusual path to get to where I am as an independent historian. I started writing fiction when my oldest was born, and I eventually found a home for my novels at Random House. I write novels set in the past, and so far that's been mostly the 20th century. And I really try to immerse myself into the time period when I'm writing. Of course, I read secondary sources on the Arrow, but I really go all in on the primary sources. I read newspapers and magazines from the days, weeks, and months that I'm writing about to see what news and culture my characters might be taking in. I look at photographs and illustrations, watch films, listen to music. But I love browsing through ephemera. I could get lost digging through boxes and file cabinets full of all of those little bits of paper that we usually throw away. And when I'm working on a project, I kind of scour antique malls and eBay listings and things like that to build my own little research archive for that project. Things like postcards, maps, brochures, advertisements, catalogs, product packaging, coupons, receipts, notebooks, and pretty much anything that I could get my hands on that relates to the time and place that I'm writing about. This absolute fascination with ephemera and material culture probably led to my specific research interest in mass media and consumer culture. I honestly think there's so much that one could learn about people in the past and their lives by looking at the objects that they bought, used, and threw away every day. So when my kids were in high school, I decided to go back to school myself and get my PhD in history. I didn't have any plans to go into academia. I liked, and I still do, like the work that I do as a writer. But I wanted to learn to be a better researcher, wanted to give myself kind of a stronger base of knowledge to work from. And honestly, I wanted to give myself the space to nerd out over history with other people who loved it as much as I did. So I focused on 20th century American history with work in women's and gender history, the history of capitalism, and the history of technology. So that's what I focused on in my graduate studies. So with my doctorate in hand, I've returned to full-time writing, using the research skills of a historian to write more immersive fiction and the narrative skills of a novelist to write what I hope is engaging nonfiction. So Pink Cars and Pocketbooks is the book that came out of my dissertation and my graduate research, and it really marries my interests in consumer culture, mass media, gender and technology, and in women's lived experiences across the 20th century.
I love your discussion already of all the cool sources. Definitely a place of nerding out about cool history and, of course, cool sources. So a very useful introduction to our conversation. I have to ask, though, to some extent, I was planning to ask this anyway, but now that you've talked about the boxes and boxes of stuff you've gone through, how did you narrow that down to sort of specific questions? What questions did you end up with in the book? And what was the process of going from the catalogs, the coupons, the receipts to defining these?
Well, one of the questions that originally prompted my research was kind of inspired by the writings of two women that I came across when I was working on a different graduate school project. But two women who were writing 50 years apart, who criticized automotive advertisers for ignoring women in their marketing. So in both the 1920s and the 1970s, 50 years apart, these two women cried neglect. So I wondered, had women really been overlooked by the auto industry in these two periods? And had nothing changed in the 50 years between them? So when I began my research, I quickly realized that the story of women and automotive advertising was unsurprisingly more complicated than that. From the beginning of the century, the women's market was actually pretty well known to those who worked in and for the auto industry. Women bought and used cars, and many of them did so really enthusiastically. The auto industry knew that they needed to sell to the women's market, and they looked to market research to help them identify and understand this market. Market research throughout the century revealed that women enjoyed driving, tinkering, and traveling just as much as men did. But marketing directed at them through the century really didn't reflect this. Instead, that marketing became more and more gendered, and it showed a deliberately constructed image of the woman driver rather than a real one. And though the auto industry boasted that they knew what women wanted, women really saw little evidence of this. So I asked myself, why did these attempts to reach out to women fail despite all of this market research? Why didn't automotive advertising really reflect the results of that market research? And why did women continue to feel neglected by the auto industry? So I investigated these questions by really delving into the market research on female automotive consumers that was done throughout the 20th century. I looked at who did the market research, how they disseminated their results, and how that information was used in advertising and marketing. I asked what role women played in this research and how they reacted to the increasingly gendered marketing that developed over the decades. I read widely in the fields of automotive history, the history of advertising, feminist history, and the history of technology. And then going back to that discussion about primary sources, I looked through archives and identified the raw material of these market research studies, the published reports of these market research studies, collections of letters and memos and notes that the advertising industry used in order to create their marketing. I looked at automotive industry expenditure reports. I looked at newspapers, magazines, a whole variety of sources in order to answer these questions. And I found that the story of how the American auto industry tried to research and sell to female consumers is not only one about marketing. I mean, it's a story of how that research was cherry-picked to provide a picture of shopping and driving women that conformed to expectations, and how those carefully constructed results made their way into published reports. And it's a story of how the media and the American public took their cue from those research reports to cultivate an increasingly narrow representation of women's automobility. And ultimately, it's a story of how women fought to take back control of these messages later in the century to define for themselves their relationships to cars and to driving.
Very interesting story indeed. Thank you for hinting at already so many of the things that I definitely want us to discuss further. Of course, given that, as you've mentioned, it is a story that takes place over quite a number of decades, I think we're probably going to move chronologically. So If we go to the first few decades of the 20th century, how and why are car manufacturers advertising to women at this point?
Well, interestingly enough, when the automobile was first introduced to the American public at kind of the turn of the 20th century, it wasn't yet coded as a masculine technology. I mean, before the 1920s, when automaking was still really in its infancy, hundreds of small manufacturers were all competing to figure out what Americans wanted in a car. And they were innovating almost countless designs. You had gas-powered cars, but also steam-powered cars and electric cars that started with a push of a button. Electric cars were actually very big in the early part of the 20th century. Body designs such as long open touring cars all the way to little three-wheeled motorettes, which were just big enough for two. So in the first 2 decades of the century, automakers advertised widely in newspapers and magazines. They directed ads to drivers in the country, the suburbs, the cities, to farm families, to the middle class, to the wealthy, and they marketed to both men and to women in the quest to find the ideal audiences for their cars because they didn't yet know who that was. Now, the field of advertising was still fairly new in the early 20th century, and automakers fumbled with the best ways to sell their products. Some automakers grew out of the carriage making industry, and they advertised their cars the same way they did wagons. So with static sketches of the vehicle and lengthy text about its specifications. They were fairly dry, but that's what they knew. That's how they knew how to do advertising. Others modeled their ads after those in the bicycle industry, which put people on its vehicles and used illustration and copy to suggest motion and excitement. So car ads appeared in women's magazines as early as 1903. That's the earliest that I was able to find. These ads showed women doing all kinds of things with their cars. Driving with friends in the countryside, shuttling husbands and children along city streets, commuting to work, and sightseeing, picnicking, or just kind of enjoying the outdoors alone next to their cars. Some of them showed women who were engaged in the mechanics of their car, like adjusting the electric headlights or filling a tire. The ads copy discussed how women could buy, drive, and care for an automobile without needing to rely on a husband, a father, or a chauffeur. They drew on imagery of the Gibson girl and the new woman, showing driving as being an activity for the healthy, outdoorsy, intelligent, and free-spirited woman. And they really offered positive messages about the enjoyment and independence that women could find behind the wheel. And this marketing didn't just take the form of print advertisements. As those were still in the early days of print advertising, automakers hid promotion behind press, photos, and events that they carefully crafted so as to appear spontaneous and organic. In the book, I discuss Alice Ramsey, who made headlines in 1909 as the first woman to make a transcontinental drive across the United States, which she did with 3 other women. The press made much about her independence and her competence, not to mention her fearlessness in making such a journey with just other women. Now, Alice was a very capable driver. She navigated a largely unmapped road system, and she had to do constant repairs and maintenance on her Maxwell automobile. But her journal and later interviews reveal that the drive was a publicity stunt orchestrated by the Maxwell Briscoe Motor Company. So press about Alice Ramsey's drive was part of a wave of articles and illustrations with positive depictions of women behind the wheel. Those who wrote the articles, took the pictures, composed the ads, and published them didn't necessarily do so in order to celebrate women drivers or to showcase women's automobility. The automotive industry was trying to sell a new product that didn't already have a known market or a reliable form of marketing. So images and texts about women drivers on the pages of early 20th century newspapers and magazines may have been inspiring to the women reading those periodicals, but even in the early days of the automobile, they were already imbued with subliminal marketing messages, and they were laying the groundwork for assumptions about female automotive consumers.
This is really interesting to understand just how early some of this is. And of course, to be reminded that cars were really new, like not that long ago. And so there were a lot of unknowns here that we tend to really forget. So for highlighting both of those points, that's already very helpful. It's not just the women as consumers we should be keeping in mind, though, in this kind of pre-World War II period. You also talk in the book about women having jobs related to cars, jobs with cars in this period, too. What were those sorts of jobs?
Well, let me just start by putting a disclaimer on this. When discussing women and automotive work, the numbers were extremely small for most of the century. For example, the 1910 census recorded 848 women working in automotive production, 230 women working as cab drivers, and only 52 women across the whole of the U.S. working as automotive dealers. Now, those numbers rose during and after World War I, but it really wasn't until the end of the century that women began making measurable progress in automotive fields. Not until the 1980s in the US were women taking jobs building, advertising, selling, fixing, and driving cars in more significant numbers. And even then, these remained small compared to the number of men in those jobs. But there are still a lot of interesting things to be said about driving and working women early in the century, especially with how that work connected to advertising, which is what we've been talking about here. So there were very few advertisements that specifically featured working women and their cars in the early decades of the century. Saxon Motor Car Company was one. They had a series of ads in the 1910s showing real women using their Saxons to commute. But there were none showing women using their cars to carry out a job. But what the early ads did show, which I already kind of touched on in my last answer, were modern women who were competent and confident behind the wheel. And these were qualities that some women parlayed into automotive jobs. And more than that, these ads helped normalize the image of a woman at the wheel at a time when very few were on the road. So to kind of put that in context with some more numbers, at the time when Alice Ramsey drove across the U.S. in 1909, she was one of only 0.2% of Americans who owned a car. By the 1920s, that number had only risen to about 8%. Before mandatory licensing, which in some states didn't happen until the 1950s, accurate numbers of women who drove were difficult to determine. But given the small number of Americans in general who were on the road in those early days, driving women would not have been a common sight at all. So promotion disguised as press, like I was just talking about, contributed more to women making inroads in automotive work, slight inroads. Companies who hired women to do work with cars boasted about this in the press, promoting themselves as inclusive and enlightened. Still, despite this, women reading the newspapers and magazines saw other women earning money from automotive work. So what were some of the jobs that women were able to do with cars? Well, usually the same jobs as men. So driving cabs and delivery trucks, working as private chauffeurs, working in garages. Chevrolet and Maxwell Briscoe, the same Maxwell Briscoe behind that Alice Ramsey publicity stunt, they both hired prominent suffragists to work in sales positions. More than selling cars, their presence was meant to sell the brands themselves to women. The advent of World War I brought new automotive opportunities to American women. National organizations like the Red Cross, the YMCA, and the National League for Women's Service, along with local women's clubs and war preparedness societies, began offering classes to women in driving and in automotive repair. Some women took over jobs that had been vacated by men who enlisted, driving cabs, public transport, and farm equipment, or working in garages and automotive factories. Others more directly worked for the war effort through one of the many women's motor services that popped up during the war. These volunteers mostly worked stateside and became familiar sights in the street. They drove ambulances and medical transports. They chauffeured government officials and military officers. They delivered medical supplies, piloted military vehicles between cities, and they helped with civil emergencies like the influenza pandemic. So the advertisements and the promotional press in the first couple of decades that highlighted women's competence and automotive know-how helped lead to women taking more automotive jobs by World War I, and just more generally becoming a more familiar sight behind the wheel.
Very interesting, this kind of visual aspect of seeing other women doing this. What then about the interwar period? Did anything change around kind of the advertising to female car consumers between World War I and II?
Well, after World War I, articles appeared in newspapers quoting car dealers, distributors, and manufacturers who publicly recognized post-war women as a larger, more educated, and more enthusiastic consumer base than they had seen before the war. The auto industry praised the woman motorist and her war service, and they credited wartime driving with improving women's mechanical skills, technical knowledge, and proficiency driving in any conditions. And this was kind of a change, even from the positive representations before the war. These were the auto industry speaking specifically about women and their automotive skills. And these articles spoke to women not only as drivers, but also as consumers, something that honestly had been rare in the media before this point. These pieces talked about the increasing number of women's purchasing cars, and they speculated on which features women might look for when visiting dealerships or auto shows, often quoting dealers, manufacturers, or others working in the automotive industry. The media speculated that the country would soon see even more women on the roads and in showrooms. So it was really clear from reading these articles just after World War I that automakers saw women as a growing and an intriguing consumer audience. So that explains the why of, why advertising kind of changed after World War I. To understand the how of the question, we need to understand changes in the field of advertising after World War I. At the beginning of the century, manufacturers often produced their own ads, which explains why early car ads frequently looked like the advertisements for wagons, carriages, and bicycles. Like I mentioned before, early automakers often came directly from those industries. By the 1910s, advertising was becoming professionalized, and the work began moving from manufacturers to advertising firms. Driven by the progressive era's love of efficiency, standardization, and evidence-based results, the advertising industry began researching the consumers they hoped to reach with their ad. So the field of market research really kind of took off at this point in the years after World War I. Magazine publishers also got in on this market research game. They utilized the platform of their publications and the ready subject pool that they had at their hand of subscription lists. And they administered surveys and gathered information from a really targeted market of consumers. And this was especially true with the publishers of women's magazines. After researching who their readers were and what their readers wanted, they used that information to attract manufacturers of those products and their advertising dollars. So this call to advertise cars to a growing consumer base of women came right at the time when market research could put information about those consumers at the auto industry's fingertips.
Okay, this is very helpful to understand because the picture is now starting to become familiar to what we expect now, right? We've got advertising films. We've got the car industry very much working with advertising firms. What we don't have yet, though, is the idea of what women care about in terms of cars is just what they look like, the aesthetic element kind of dominating everything else. When and how does that idea come into play?
In my book, I argue that this idea that women only cared about automotive style and aesthetic stemmed directly from this early market research that I was just talking about, particularly that done by Curtis Publishing Company, which published Saturday Evening Post and Ladies' Home Journal, among other popular magazines. So in the early 1910s, Curtis established a division of commercial research under a man named Charles Coolidge Parlin to research the readers of Curtis publications as consumer markets. Knowing who read their magazines and what those people bought would give the publisher information to draw advertisers. When Parlin noticed very little auto advertising on the pages of Ladies' Home Journal, he began to specifically study women and their car purchases in a series of market research studies from 1914 to 1932. Although his researchers largely interviewed male car dealers about the women who shop for cars, female car owners and drivers were also surveyed. So for the first time in this brief history of the automobile, women had a voice and a line of communication to the auto industry. They were being asked about their relationships to automobiles, and this was big. So they talked about the active role that they took in family car purchases, how they valued economy, reliability, mechanical prowess, and ease of driving in the cars that they bought. However, Parlin seized upon scant mentions of style and appearance, and he highlighted these cherry-picked results in his published reports of the studies. So these carefully curated results confirmed what market researchers and the American population as a whole already assumed about women in cars. That women might tremble at the thought of being responsible for such a powerful machine, but, they might be swayed by the sight of a pretty body style. It didn't matter that the women themselves said they appreciated mechanical innovations. Men were skeptical, and interviews with car dealers who thought that women in the showroom were flighty and clueless, they seemed to validate that skepticism. Those car dealers, who were professionals after all, must know what they were talking about when they said that women cared more about paint color, upholstery, and body design. Parlin's reports, which were published and promoted to the auto industry, they established this myth and they gave it the reassuring stamp of scientific approval. It was research, after all. Now, in the early 1930s, General Motors introduced the idea of annual model changes, encouraging Americans to replace their old cars with new because of style and trend rather than need. But the advertising industry jumped on this. They used fashion and glamour to market cars, both on and off the pages of magazines. This type of marketing, it really seemed to satisfy what automakers thought women were most interested in. Things like the lines of the car, the body style, and how nice it looked sitting in front of the house. Just as Parlin's market research had seemingly reinforced accepted ideas about women and technology, this new fashion-focused marketing just really, it further reinforced those assumptions.
This is so interesting to understand, and especially the idea of it's science, therefore don't question it.
Absolutely.
Yeah, this is really interesting. Is this why then the automotive industry seems to sort of tune out women after World War II?
Yes, in part. And, it's important to remember too that the auto industry didn't suddenly tune out women. They just hadn't done a very good job of listening in the first place, starting with Parlin's studies. But that did become worse in the post-war years. So after World War II, there was a resurgence in market research as companies all fought for post-war consumer dollars. Just like after World War I, women were again the focus of this research. They were expected to return to the home after doing wartime work and to concentrate on the family. And most importantly, to fill their houses and their lives with a whole array of new consumer goods, including automobiles. So women's magazines, again, jumped into researching women and the cars that they wanted to park in the driveways of their new suburban homes. Unlike Charles Coolidge Parlin's earlier studies that largely interviewed male dealers, these post-war studies by magazine publishers, they gave women more of a voice, actually, using their subscription lists or kind of call-outs on the pages of the magazines themselves. Some of them had cards that you could tear off, fill out, and mail in as a postcard. They used these methods to survey, poll, and ask women directly about how they shopped for and used cars. Just like in those earlier studies, women repeated that they prioritized safety, reliability, and economy in a car. They wanted features to keep back seats safe and clean for children. They wanted the ability to adjust the cars to fit their bodies and to fit their needs. They wanted straightforward information about how to maintain and repair their cars. And frankly, they wanted cars that they'd enjoy driving. Now, these post-war studies, they also included questions about appearance, paint color, and upholstery fabric. And I am sure you could see where this is headed. As with the earlier studies, researchers again highlighted these answers in their final reports instead of the topics that their female respondents had stressed. The auto industry saw this as just more proof that women only considered the car another attractive household appliance to add to their domestic lives. Post-war automotive marketing to women stressed fashion and femininity and positioned the car as a stylish tool to help women carry out family duties. That marketing didn't sell it as a machine to enjoy for its own sake. Women had asked for designs that made cars safer and more comfortable, and for marketing that helped them understand the cars they drove. The auto industry instead gave them pink cars and, honestly, the pretense of listening to them.
Pretense is doing a whole bunch of work there, which is getting, as I said, to the more familiar picture, perhaps.
And the idea of pretense, too, it's kind of this repeated stamp of scientific approval that market research seemed to lend these published reports. It was all under the mantle of research, so it must be true. And by doing the market research studies on female automotive consumers, these industries could say out loud, well, we really are listening to women. We're asking them, look at us having this conversation. But women weren't seeing the results of what they repeatedly said and asked for.
And did anything change as we move further away from World War II? Obviously, for example, lots of things get kind of disrupted or pushed back against in the 1960s. Was this kind of removal of female consumers from the car industry part of that? Or do we still see the same sort of absence?
Well, a lot of the things that kind of start... The disruptions that we start to see in the 1960s, the little bits of pushback, were honestly more demographic in nature and economic. So changes in women's demographics and economic circumstances in the 1960s meant that their automotive needs also changed. One change was that by the 1960s, a lot more women in the United States were working outside of the home. On a practical level, this meant that more women needed transportation to and from work. It no longer was feasible for a family to only have one automobile if all the adults in the house needed to get to a job. So you started to see more second cars being bought than you necessarily saw in earlier decades. That more women working outside the home also meant that, whether married or not, the income that those women brought into the house gave more of them a greater say, or the only say, in how to spend that money. They had more purchasing power. So advertising the car as a domestic appliance to the housewife was no longer the best course of action, and the auto industry realized that. Not when a greater percentage of the female market now worked outside of the domestic sphere. not only were more women employed, but many of those women were single and living alone in far greater numbers than in earlier decades. On one hand, this presented kind of a logistical disruption. Women living alone by necessity needed to do more of their own maintenance. They didn't have another adult in the house. They didn't have a husband or a father who they could call on to change the oil or things like that. So this applied to automotive care. The information on their cars' mechanics that women had been asking for decades was now a more immediate need. And those in automotive advertising began reassessing the depth of their advertisements. But the single woman of the 1960s, she wasn't just a demographic, though. Following Helen Gurley Brown's 1962 book, Sex and the Single Girl, singledom became an identity where young, unmarried women's careers took a backseat to their desires, their hobbies, their relationships, and their independent living. Now, there was another disruption that I think was meaningful in the change of advertising to women in the 1960s, and that came from within the industry itself. That was the introduction of the affordable compact car. I should qualify the very reluctant introduction of the compact car, as the big three automakers spent decades fighting popular opinion on that subject. Despite women asking for smaller, more maneuverable cars that fit their bodies a little better, American automakers insisted in the post-war decade that bigger was better. And that's where we got the huge boat-shaped cars of the 1950s with that flowing space-age body design and long tail fins. The auto industry didn't want to change their tune that women valued style over function. It wasn't until women began enthusiastically buying foreign compact cars, and by 1959, they accounted for 10% of auto sales in the US, that the American auto industry finally gave in and introduced their own models. So all of these disruptions led to a shift in automotive advertising to women. Instead of advertising the car as a means to perform household tasks, as an extension of the home's domestic space, or as a stylish fashion accessory, the auto industry began marketing the car to women as identity.
This is really interesting because that sounds very familiar. Marketing things based on identity, appealing to that sort of language. But of course, as you mentioned, you said it changed kind of a bit, right? There's a lot still here around women just, oh, you just like the pretty car, no matter what women report back and say, actually, we want X, Y, Z.
And actually, the selling of cars as identity in the 60s wasn't perfect because it wasn't necessarily the identity that women wanted. It still didn't quite get at the relationship that they wanted in their cars, especially when sports cars were being advertised to women. There were a lot of connections being made between the body of the sports car and the body of the woman, even when those ads weren't directed at men. Sex was being used to sell them to women as well. And that wasn't necessarily what they were going to, but it was a change in how they've been marketed before.
Yeah, no, definitely a particular way of marketing identity.
Yes.
What happened with women who were less than enticed by these messages and decided to kind of turn their back on this and do their own thing? What did that look like?
Well, in the 1960s and the 1970s, women just really started bypassing the auto industry and creating their own channels of communication to share automotive knowledge. And I found this a really fascinating part of the story. One of the ways that they did this was through the pages of newspapers and magazines. In the 1950s, there had been a few automotive columns by and for women. They mainly focused on driving. They discussed things like driver's education, traffic safety, driving in inclement weather, traveling with children. But they must have been popular enough with women who were probably glad to see automotive information directed at them. All of These columns in the 50s ran for years. But in the 1960s and the 1970s, the number of automotive columns in newspapers and in women's magazines blossomed. So Women's Day, McCall's, Glamour, and Vogue all established regular automotive columns, and newspapers ran nationally syndicated columns of their own. Although these columns all touched on the same issues as those in the 1950s, they expanded on the information they gave. They also discussed things like shopping for fuel-efficient cars, driving and parking, doing regular maintenance like spring tune-ups or winterization, troubleshooting automotive problems, acting quickly during highway emergencies, and tackling unexpected repairs. These were things that weren't discussed in the 1950s. These were new, and these were some of the things that women had been asking for. The column in Woman's Day, written by automotive journalist Julie Candler, ran from 1964 to 1982. And she frequently got letters from readers happy to have the automotive information that they had been asking for. Along with all of these columns and articles, in the mid-1970s, women began writing and publishing automotive handbooks and repair manuals addressed to women. I was absolutely astonished to find 9 that came out in a span of only 4 years. Not only did these handbooks and manuals contain clear explanations about mechanics, driving, maintenance, and repair, but they also brought back the positive messages about women's automobility from earlier in the century. Through their images and their text, women were shown to be enthusiastic drivers, car owners, travelers, tinkerers, and mechanics. There was a love of the automobile in there, and women were a part of it. This take back of automotive messaging was helped along by second wave feminism and the growing interest in self-education and DIY that was part of that movement. The increasing number of women who began working in and for the automotive and advertising industries in the 70s and 80s also helped to secure that messaging. I came across an interview with one car saleswoman who said that she sold cars with, quote, facts and feminism. And that attitude is becoming more common in this period. Those women who worked in automotive sales and marketing or who wrote as automotive journalists used their voices to speak directly to female consumers and to give them real information. This take back of automotive messaging was also pushed along by the Women in Print movement, which was a movement of female writers, printers, booksellers, and activists who sought to write and publish material by, for, and about women. It was a deliberate feminist attempt to create an alternative communications circuit between women, one that bypassed men who tried to gatekeep information and who was allowed to access it. The books and the periodicals published within the Women in Print movement often captured voices and promoted subjects overlooked or rejected by mainstream publishing. But more than the tangible publications that the movement produced, it more broadly encouraged the sharing of knowledge between women. So all of those handbooks and repair manuals, those automotive columns, the ad women and saleswomen who were selling with facts and feminism, they all helped women to share automotive information, to build a knowledge collective, and to start defining for themselves what a woman at the wheel really looked like.
This take back is fascinating to read about in the book, and obviously that explanation is helpful, but there's really cool details too for any listeners who get more into it. Obviously there is the whole book to read, but it's really interesting to see this kind of women engaging with it, making it kind of what they want, then getting sort of pushed out and then going, okay, well, let's make it again. Because in some ways, this sounds similar to what you were telling us about the early 20th century of women getting involved in the kind of nascent car industry.
Yes.
And then pushed out and then kind of making their own thing happening. There's a cycle thing going on here.
There is a cycle that I identified.
What's up with the cycle?
Okay, well, one thing I noticed when I kind of moved later in the century is that in the 1980s, the auto industry began announcing that they had just discovered the women's market, despite their own archives bulging with evidence like market research, advertising campaigns, automotive literature, showing that they had already done that. So this is something that I found interesting in my research, that there were 3 distinct eras where those in automotive advertising and selling announced that they suddenly discovered female consumers. And those eras were the 1920s, the 1950s, and the 1980s. So an easy response is that those so-called discoveries just coincided with periods of economic prosperity. So the 20s, the 50s, and the 80s all saw a boom in consumer spending in the US after periods of belt tightening. They also saw a flurry of market research, as we've already talked about, into the most promising consumer markets. But I think that the answer doesn't necessarily lie in these 3 periods of market research into the female automotive consumer. By looking instead at how the advertising, publishing, and automotive industries reported this research in these 3 decades, that women saw their cars only as stylish accessories or as domestic appliances, I think that a more interesting explanation appears. So these rediscoveries of women as car buyers and users coincided with more than just periods of prosperity. Each of these decades line up with moments of what journalist and feminist Susan Faludi calls backlash. Backlash, as Faludi describes it, happens at points in history where feminist gains seemingly threaten those in power and disrupt what those people in power consider the status quo. So those parts of society that feel threatened push back and try to minimize what women had gained. This pushback takes the form of carefully constructed rhetoric and sometimes deliberate propaganda that tries to convince women that feminist progress is actually making them unhappy. Those in power use these backlash myths to support both old stereotypes and new restrictions on women's gains. So in the 1920s, women had advances in the workplace and higher education, and in the voting booth with the 19th Amendment that gave women in the US the right to vote. As Faludi describes, Americans were worried about women competing with men for jobs and for places in universities. So they began pushing back and trying to force women to retreat from those gains by doing things like lowering women's pay or vilifying career women. After World War II brought women high-paying industrial jobs, union memberships, and federal assistance for things like daycare and maternity care, they were pushed back into the home with federal regulations on hiring and government assistance that favored male veterans, and with workplace restrictions for married women. And the work of the 1970s feminists who fought for gains in equal employment and pay, in family planning, and in financial independence, among other things, prompted the backlash of the 1980s with the rise of right-wing conservatism, the creation of the anti-abortion movement, and renewed cries that working and unmarried women were destroying the American family. Well, the media often wrote about women choosing education, careers, and personal freedom along with home and family. In backlash eras, that messaging was reversed. Fiction, articles, film, television, and of course advertisements instead told women that they could not have it all. They had to choose a path, and the only correct path was towards the home. Although the concept of backlash has broadened since Faludi first introduced it in 1991, the timeline of advances and retreats that she outlines really bears a striking resemblance to how the automotive industry researched, discussed, and advertised driving women across the 20th century. In decades that Faludi sees as points of progress for women, car ads and automotive literature feature women using cars to play, explore, and work. They use their cars to reflect their identity and to demonstrate expertise. But in decades of backlash, ads and literature show women using cars as status symbols, as stylish accessories, or as domestic tools. This second type of ad historically followed a rediscovery of women as a consumer market and a renewal of interest in researching that market. So despite how women tried to define their relationships to automobiles in each of these waves of market research, the reports of that research in the 1920s, the 1950s, and the 1980s all focused on women's supposed fixation on style and design. There's a quote from Faludi that I love, where she says that when those in power felt threatened by women's gains, they attempted to control those women by, quote, pushing them to conform to comfortingly nostalgic norms and shrinking them in the cultural imagination to a manageable size. So perhaps car ads in those decades, with their ads of women posed prettily by a showy sedan or riding contentedly in the passenger seat, were doing exactly that, minimizing women's automobility so that they didn't appear too threatening with their mobility and their knowledge. And perhaps they were so intent on researching women at all in those decades for the same reason. Each rediscovery allowed automakers, ad men, and the media to redefine women's relationships to cars in a way that was acceptable to the current moment.
Very interesting to look big picture at these cycles and understand the similarities and differences across time. And I think that's probably a good place to kind of end our discussion about the sort of main arguments of the book. But I would like us to go even further full circle, if we can, back to what you were saying right at the beginning around the kind of ephemera and cool sources you got to dig through. Was there anything that you came across that was particularly fun or surprising to discover, even if it didn't end up making it into the book?
Well, some of the things that I found most fascinating in this research were not necessarily the documents themselves, but the numbers of them. So one of the primary sources that had originally inspired me, I kind of referenced that earlier when I talked about the two women writing in the 20s and the 70s. So one of them was a speech given by a home economist and motoring advocate named Elizabeth Hallam Bone in 1922. She spoke at the National Automobile Chamber of Commerce Advertising Managers meeting, which was a big deal. She was the first woman to address them, and she criticized her all-male audience for not reaching out to women with their advertising in 1922. Now, Bone was a tenacious and well-prepared speaker. She brought data. She'd polled women on the subscription list of a woman's magazine and found that over half owned a car and had taken an active role shopping for the car. She claimed that she rarely saw car ads directed at women. So when I started my research, I knew that Bone's claim that there had been no advertising towards women was not correct. I was surprised, however, at just how much advertising there had been in the years before she spoke in 1922. In fact, from 1900 to 1922, when Bone spoke to the National Automobile Chamber of Commerce, automotive companies ran over 600 advertisements directly targeting women. And I looked at all of them. So I define automotive ads directed at women as being any that contained woman-only or woman-forward images, such as a woman driving with or without passengers, admiring or shopping for a car without a man present, or engaging in some other activity like a picnic or a game of golf next to a car without a man around. I also counted ads containing copy that addresses or refers to female car buyers, owners, and drivers, regardless of what the image was. Like I said earlier, a lot of the early ads showed only the product and not the users of the product. So some of these ads only showed a car, a line drawing of a car, but the copy talked about women buying, owning, and using that car. I didn't count ads that only referred to women as passengers, unless the text made clear that despite being a passenger, the women purchased and owned the car. So a lot of early ads showed wealthy women and their chauffeurs, but they were the ones who shopped for and bought and owned that car. I only counted ads advertising cars, not those from other industries that used images of women in cars to sell their products. So over 600 advertisements in the years before Bone made her speech. That shocked me. I was also surprised at how many positive representations of driving women outside of advertisements that I found in the years before Bone's speech. So articles, interviews, cartoons, photos, images, essays, stories, just other mentions of women who were driving outside of an advertisement. I didn't expect to find so many images and so many stories of women enjoying their cars and driving for the sheer pleasure of it. I searched periodical databases, digitized issues of individual women's magazines to find material for or about driving and car owning women. I counted anything about automobiles that was addressed to women or described women taking an active role in buying, driving, building, tinkering, repairing, or otherwise interacting with a car. Even given the limitations of what was digitized and available through those databases and digital archives, I counted almost 1,500 distinct pieces before 1922. And out of that 1,500, only 15 play up the fast and flighty kind of woman driver stereotype. The rest provided positive, encouraging, and admiring messages about women's automobility. Something else that I found interesting, and this kind of goes back to what you were talking about looking at the big picture, is how women's changing relationships with cars, as seen through marketing messages and images, mirrored changing ideals of femininity throughout the 20th century. So, the mobile and active woman of the progressive era, the newly enfranchised, outspoken woman of the 1920s, the stylish and upwardly mobile woman of the 1930s, the patriotic and thrifty wartime woman, the feminine and family-focused post-war woman, the youthful and busy working woman of the 1960s, and the self-sufficient and confident woman of the 1970s. Looking at the history of how men marketed cars to women throughout the 20th century and how women shopped for and used those cars tells us as much about shifting definitions of womanhood as it does about changes in technology.
Very interesting summation of our conversation on the book. Is there anything you've got your eye on to work on next, whether or not it's a book, whether or not it's nonfiction, anything you want to preview or highlight?
Well, I have a few new projects, both fiction and nonfiction, that I'm kind of playing around with right now, but can't say too much about yet. For both, my research touches on consumerism, post-war womanhood, housing development, suburbanization. As with Pink Cars and Pocketbooks, I'm really interested in women's lived experiences as consumers and as users of products. And I'm looking at those topics from a few different angles.
Well, that sounds like lots of fun source material to immerse yourself with.
Always.
Any listeners who want to do that with the book, obviously we've been talking about, you can read it, titled Pink Cars and Pocketbooks, How American Women Bought Their Way into the Driver's Seat, published by Johns Hopkins University Press in 2025. Jessica, thank you so much for joining me on the podcast.
Thank you for inviting me.